Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling feminist myths, going beyond those classic tales and looking at how traditional narratives often diminish the feminine. Our guide this time is an academic paper titled Silencing the Divine: Myths, Patriarchy, and the Eternal Diminishment of the Feminine.
Oh, yeah. It's a fascinating deep dive. These stories from Medusa to Pandora might be familiar, but we're going to uncover some surprising truths.
Exactly. We'll be looking at Greek and Roman myths, Norse legends, Hindu epics, even Celtic indigenous and Abrahamic traditions.
Wow.
With all that diversity, you wouldn't think there'd be much in common.
Right. You'd think that, but it's actually remarkable how similar these myths are in how they portray women and feminine power, despite coming from totally different cultures. It's almost like there's a hidden script everyone was following.
A hidden script. That sounds a bit ominous. Let's start with a really famous figure from Greek mythology, Medusa.
Oh?
You know her, the one with snakes for hair.
A Medusa the monster. Right. Most people don't know the full story, though. She wasn't born a monster. Medusa was actually assaulted by Poseidon, the god of the sea.
Really?
And instead of punishing Poseidon, Athena, the goddess of wisdom, punished Medusa for being raped.
Hold on, seriously? She was punished for being assaulted. That's just blaming the victim, and that's in Greek mythology.
It is, and it raises some serious questions, like why would a powerful goddess punish the victim instead of the perpetrator? And how often is this pattern of blaming women for men's actions repeated, not just in myths, but in our own world?
Now that you mention it, it's definitely a pattern we see over and over even today. Okay, let's move on to Norse mythology. We've got Freya, who is a goddess of love and beauty, but also war and death. What a combo.
Yeah, but this is where that hidden script comes back. Often Freya's complexities are simplified and she's reduced to just her beauty or seductive nature. It's like the myths can't handle the idea of a woman embodying both beauty and immense power.
It's like, pick a lane, Freya. Beautiful or powerful. You can't be both. It seems like a way to make her more palatable, less threatening.
Exactly. And that simplification diminishes her power, makes her less of a challenge to the established order.
Okay, so we're seeing a pattern here. Powerful women being punished or simplified.
Yeah.
What about Hindu mythology? I know a little bit about Sita from the epic Ramayana. She's known for her unwavering loyalty and purity, right?
Yes, but what if we look at Sita's story from a different angle? What if, instead of just a tale of virtue, it's a critique of the pressure on women to silently endure suffering?
So it's not just about Sita as an individual, but about the broader societal expectations placed on women at the time.
Precisely. And understanding that context completely changes how we interpret her story and its message.
Okay, before we get into the themes that connect these myths, let's look at a few more examples. The source mentions the Celtic goddess, the Morrigan.
Right.
She was a figure of sovereignty and power, but often depicted as a harbinger of doom.
It's that tendency, again, twisting female power into something to be feared rather than respected. Like powerful women are inherently dangerous and need to be controlled.
And that makes me think of the Aztec goddess Coyolxauhqui.
Yeah.
She was dismembered by her brother.
Oh, yeah.
That's a brutal image of female power being literally ripped apart by patriarchy.
Definitely a stark image. And while not all myths follow this pattern, like the Haudenosaunee story of Sky Woman, which places feminine power at the heart of creation, there's a clear trend of diminishing or demonizing female power across cultures.
So there are exceptions, but overall it sounds like we've got some disturbing similarities here.
We do, and that's what's so fascinating about these myths. They show us how deeply ingrained these patriarchal patterns are.
So we've seen how this hidden script plays out in individual stories.
Yeah.
What are some of the overarching themes that tie all of this together?
One of the most prominent themes is the vilification of female autonomy, punishing women for being independent.
Like Medusa being punished for something that wasn't her fault.
Exactly, and there are others. Think about Lilith, often demonized for refusing to submit to Adam, or the story of Draupadi in the Mahabharata. She is publicly humiliated for speaking her mind and challenging those in power.
So it's not just about these individual women, it's sending a message: don't step out of line, don't be too independent, or you will be punished.
Chilling, but accurate. These stories are cautionary tales meant to discourage women from seeking autonomy.
Okay, that's pretty heavy. What other themes emerge from these myths?
Another is the control of female sexuality. The idea that a woman's desire is inherently dangerous and needs to be contained.
Now, this is where the story of Pandora's box comes in, right? Opening the box and unleashing chaos upon the world.
Yes. Pandora's curiosity, often linked to female desire, is portrayed as the ultimate downfall. It frames female desire as something to be feared and controlled rather than celebrated or even accepted.
And we see this with Freya too, right? Her sexuality overshadows her other roles. It's like her power is only acceptable if it's viewed through a very specific, male-defined lens.
Exactly. That filtering that control limits female power.
So we've got punishment for autonomy and the control of sexuality. What else is going on in this hidden script?
Well, there's also the gradual erosion of the feminine divine. Many early cultures worshipped goddesses as all-powerful creators. But over time, those goddesses were replaced by male deities, or their powers diminished.
Like the Morrigan going from a powerful goddess to this scary figure of doom.
Exactly. It almost mirrors the rise of patriarchal power structures in society. As men gained authority, the myths seem to have been rewritten to reflect this shift.
Wow, that's quite a change. Okay, so they got punishment control and the diminishing of the feminine divine. Anything else?
One more key theme is victim blaming and silencing. We've already talked about Medusa, but think about Cassandra Curse, to always tell the truth but never be believed. Or Coiled Zaku punished for daring to challenge male dominance.
So it's like these myths create this idea that women's suffering is either deserved or their own fault, which makes it harder to speak out against injustice.
You've hit the nail on the head. It creates an environment where women are afraid to speak up because they fear they won't be believed. Or worse, that they'll be blamed for their own suffering.
Okay, we've covered a lot here, and it's pretty intense.
Correct.
These myths paint a pretty grim picture of how women have been viewed and treated throughout history.
They do. But recognizing these patterns helps us understand how ingrained these patriarchal ideas are. Not just in ancient myths, but in our world, too.
So where do we go from here? Do we just toss out all these myths and start over?
Not necessarily. Remember, these stories can also be sources of power and inspiration, especially when we look at them with fresh eyes and a feminist perspective.
That's a great point. So instead of discarding these stories, maybe we can reclaim them, re-examine them, and find a new understanding.
Exactly. Let's take Medusa, for example. Her story is a powerful example of how a myth can both demonize and empower women.
Okay, I'm ready to dive deeper into Medusa's story and see how we can reframe it. So Medusa, as we were saying, her story is often told as a cautionary tale, but maybe there's more to it.
Definitely. When you look closer, you realize that Medusa wasn't always the monstrous Gorgon. She was originally a beautiful young woman who well caught the eye of Poseidon.
Not in a good way.
Right.
He wanted her, and not in a respectful, let's go on a date kind of way.
Exactly. He pursued her relentlessly, and Medusa sought refuge in Athena's temple, hoping for protection in a sacred space dedicated to the goddess of wisdom.
You'd think that would be a safe haven.
You would. But that's where things get really dark. Poseidon violated her, right there in the temple. It was a horrific act, a double violation, assault and sacrilege.
And Athena punished Medusa instead of Poseidon. It seems incredibly unjust.
It is. She transformed Medusa into a Gorgon, a creature so terrifying that anyone who looks at her turns to stone, basically punished for being the victim,
Right.
which, as we've seen, is a pattern throughout history and even today.
It's just heartbreaking. Seeking refuge in a temple and ending up blamed and punished for what happened to you. The source really emphasizes that Medusa's fate isn't just about one woman's suffering. It reflects a broader societal tendency to blame women for men's actions.
Exactly. It's a powerful statement about how women have been silenced and disempowered throughout history. Makes you wonder how often this victim blaming still happens.
Yeah, that's a question we all need to ask ourselves.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about the injustice in Medusa's story, but the source also talks about reclaiming her as a figure of power. How can we reconcile those two things, her victimhood and her strength?
That's a really interesting question. I think it's about understanding that even as a monster, Medusa is powerful. Her gaze, the one that turns men to stone, it's both a curse and indeed a weapon.
Like a twisted form of protection. The world wronged her, and now she has this power, however horrifying, to fight back.
Exactly, and that's what makes this reinterpretation so compelling. Medusa isn't just a victim, she's a survivor who uses her power to resist further harm.
It's a powerful image, the snake-haired Gorgon. Not as a monster, but as a symbol of female resilience in the face of incredible cruelty.
And that resilience is something to admire, not fear. But what's fascinating is that these ancient patterns we see in Medusa's story and other myths, they don't just stay in the past. They echo through time and show up in how women are portrayed in modern media.
So it's not just ancient Greece or Rome. It's the stories we tell ourselves today about women and power.
Precisely. And the source has some great examples, like the classic evil queen trope. You see it everywhere, from fairy tales to fantasy.
Oh yeah, the jealous stepmother, the power-hungry sorceress, the queen who'll do anything to stay beautiful and in control. It feels like a direct descendant of the Medusa archetype. The woman punished for her ambition, her power, or even her beauty.
That's a great observation. And even when we see strong women in media, they often fall into pretty narrow archetypes. The source talks about the limitations of the strong woman trope, how it often defines female strength only in relation to male approval or competition.
Like the female action hero who can kick butt but still needs to be rescued.
Hmm.
Or the brilliant scientist who's emotionally stunted. They're strong in one specific way but lack depth.
Exactly. It's like we still struggle to portray female strength as multifaceted and independent, not just a reflection of masculine norms. Our source brings up Luc Besson. He's known for creating strong female characters. But when you look closer, you see those same patriarchal patterns at play. Take Li Lu from The Fifth Element. She's this powerful, supreme being, but her character is infantilized and ultimately depends on the male protagonist.
What about Laureline in Valerian?
Competent and resourceful, but mainly there to support the male protagonist's adventures. Her depth and agency are sacrificed for a romantic subplot. Kind of disappointing.
It's like even when creators are trying to portray strong women, they fall back on those familiar limiting narratives that undermine female agency.
It happens more often than you'd think. That's why it's so important to be critical of the media we consume, recognize these patterns, these limitations, and demand more nuanced and empowering portrayals of women.
Are there any examples of modern media that get it right, that show us more balanced, authentic representations of women?
Absolutely. There are amazing filmmakers and storytellers pushing boundaries and challenging those harmful tropes. The source specifically mentions The Woman King. Have you seen it?
Yeah. The true story of an all-female warrior unit in Dahomey. So inspiring.
A powerful example of how to tell a story about female strength and agency without relying on cliches.
What about TV shows? Anything stand out?
The source points to Fleabag, a brilliant series with a complex, flawed, and hilarious female protagonist.
I love that show. It celebrates female desire and vulnerability in a way that feels honest and revolutionary.
Exactly. And that's what we need, stories that allow women to be fully human with all their complexities and contradictions.
Okay, we've gone from ancient myths to modern movies. What does all this mean for us as viewers, readers, consumers of media?
I think it means we have a responsibility to be aware, to recognize these patterns and limitations, and support creators telling more diverse and empowering stories.
Because ultimately, the stories we tell ourselves, the ones we consume and create, they shape the world we live in.
Absolutely. And if we want a world that values and respects women, we need to start by telling better, more truthful stories.
Welcome back to our deep dive into feminist myths. We've really gone deep, haven't we? Uncovering some fascinating and sometimes unsettling truths about these stories.
It really has been quite a journey, exploring how these myths often diminish or demonize female power and how those patterns still appear in media today. But I think this is the really exciting part, where we get to think about what it all means and how it applies to your own life.
I like where this is going. So the paper ends with a really thought-provoking question. If we re-examine myths from a feminist perspective, how might our understanding of history and our vision for the future change?
It is a big question. It makes us think about how these patriarchal narratives are woven into our culture and how they've shaped our understanding of the world. We've talked about how these myths often portray women as either passive victims or dangerous temptresses. But what if we challenge those assumptions?
What if we started seeing these women as complex individuals with their own motivations and agency? Would that change how we view history?
Absolutely. Questioning those limiting narratives helps us recognize how women have been marginalized and silenced throughout history. We might even be inspired to challenge those patterns today.
Okay, so that's the understanding and history part. What about the vision for the future part? How can reframing these myths help us create a better future?
Well, if we can imagine a future where those harmful tropes are no longer dominant, where women are free to be powerful and autonomous without being demonized or punished, then we can start working towards it. We can tell new stories, ones that celebrate the feminine divine in all its complexity and strength.
So instead of just accepting the stories we've been told, we can question them, challenge them, and even rewrite them.
Exactly. That's what's so empowering about this. It gives us the agency to shape our own narratives and create a world that reflects our values.
This has been an incredible deep dive. I feel like I've learned so much and gained a whole new perspective on stories I thought I knew.
Me too. I hope our listeners feel the same.
So before we wrap up, I want to leave everyone with one final thought. What other myths might be hiding surprising truths? What stories can you retell to challenge outdated norms and create a more equitable world?
Think about the stories you've been told, the narratives that shaped your worldview. Are there any that feel incomplete or limited? What would happen if you dug deeper, challenged the assumptions, and retold those stories in a way that felt more truthful and empowering?
That's a great challenge. Until next time, keep diving deep and keep questioning everything.